You are the Barbara and David Zalaznick Professor of Business at Columbia University, co-director of the Center for Contracts and Economic Organization at the Columbia Law School, and visiting professor at Imperial College London. And your presentation today, it's very exciting, is called Green Swan, Central Banking and Climate Change. And it will explore how climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy pose new systemic financial risks, those green swans. So I'll let you the floor.
Thank you, Mylis. Can everybody hear me fine?
Perfectly fine.
Great, thank you. So I will give you a presentation of a book that I co-authored with Morgan Després, Luis Awazu Pereira da Silva, Frédéric Samama, and Romain Schwartzman. These names probably don't mean anything to you, but let me tell you that my co-authors are in very strategic positions at the moment in central banks and also at the Bank of International Settlement and at the major asset manager, European asset manager Amundi. And what I mean by strategic position is they're in positions to move the agenda forward on this very big topic, a new topic, which is central banking and climate change. Next slide, please. And you can skip this one. I'll jump into the next slide. So you might not think of central banks as immediately as key actors when it comes to climate change, and I'll try and convince you, however, that is the case. And if you want, let me do a little detour to convince you by briefly mentioning what happened last year with the COVID crisis. So this is another type of shock that was typically not something that central banks would pay attention to, a global pandemic. And for those of you who have followed what happened over the year, I mean, there was many events, but there were some notable events in March 2020 when essentially it became clear to the world that the pandemic wouldn't be able to be contained just in China, that there had been contagion and outbreaks in Europe and in the US. And when financial markets began to understand that this would become a global issue, there was essentially a financial crisis, mini financial crisis for a few weeks in the second half of March of 2020. And that then led to major interventions by central banks in Europe, the European Central Bank, and in the US, the Federal Reserve, and also in other countries, to essentially save the financial system. And the inescapable conclusion that everyone drew from this event in the central banking community is that the natural disasters, such as pandemics, but also climate change related disasters, can be a systemic financial risk and therefore have to be considered and managed by central banks. Next slide, please. Now, let me give you three examples of the kinds of challenges that are going to hit our societies and economies and that are relevant for central banks. Now, this slide tells you roughly the challenge that we face in bringing down carbon emissions globally. The numbers are staggering. Some of you are scientists and you can relate to that better than me as an economist. But let me sort of give you a sort of rough picture of what's involved. So in 2020, because of COVID and the lockdowns that followed, the reduction in economic activity. So as a result of all that, carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions globally over the year 2020 declined by between 6 and 7%. Now, if we want to make sure that we stay within a limit of no more than 2 degrees centigrade rise in average temperatures by the end of the century or by 2050, then what we need to do is we need to reduce carbon emissions, global carbon emissions, at the same rate year by year as we did in 2020, which tells you how big the challenge is, because of course we paid a huge price in terms of lower economic activity to get to the reduction of 6 and 7%. So can we do this on a year-by-year basis until 2050? So that's one major challenge we're going to be facing. Next slide, please. The other challenge is, of course, rising temperatures if we don't do anything. And what I want to highlight here is what rising temperatures means for a big fraction of the population, global population that lives in tropical areas, lives around the equator. So Brazil, Central America, Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and so on. And basically, what this picture shows you is that if temperatures keep rising as predicted, if we don't bring down carbon emissions, but even if we do bring down carbon emissions, temperatures will keep rising. Well, what that means is that there are whole areas of the world that will become uninhabitable, just because the combination of high temperature and humidity will make it, will create episodes that people can't survive unless they have access to air conditioning and so on. And one area in particular that will be hit hard is Nigeria. And Nigeria by 2050 is projected to have a population the size of the United States today. So what this is telling you is that global warming is going to result in major migration, climate-related events that will lead to migration. We're already seeing this year with Central America, with Honduras having been hit with a very severe hurricane, Hurricane Eta. And that has been partly the reason why we've seen a rise in migration flows and attempts to enter the US, which you have followed in the press. Next slide, please. And so if you combine the challenge of having to reduce emissions and all the physical risk challenges from climate change, you end up with an extremely complex systemic problem for central banks. And that's really why this report is part of the session today that was organized, because of the complexity of the risks, but also in a way, the certainty that a lot of those risks will materialize because climate change is happening as I'm speaking. And so this table tells you how transition risk interacts with physical risk and all the, just a small list of all the potential transmission channels. Next slide, please. And when it comes to physical risk, again, you're the scientists here, you probably have a better sense than I do. The meaning, what it means that if the temperatures rise by 1 degree centigrade or 3 degrees centigrade, has will lead to many different tipping points. That was the term that Sharon used earlier, which we think is a very appropriate term when it comes to understanding all the risks around climate change. And here, just want to read you a little, quaint example from Al Gore's book in 2006, where he points out that the science textbook had to be rewritten because they were used to say that it's impossible to have hurricanes in the South Atlantic, but the year of the publication his book, There Just Have Been One. And that's just a simple example illustrating complexities and nonlinearities and tipping points that will accompany the materialization of all these risks. Next slide, please. And so what it means for central banks is that they have to embrace climate change, natural disasters within their mandates in terms of managing risks, financial risks, risks to the economy. But these are such complex risks that they can't use the traditional tools from sorry. I had switched off my other phone, but not this one. My apologies. So the point of this slide here is that the traditional risk management approaches in financial markets, modeling of statistical models, probability models, value at risk models, that's all inadequate. And what central banks have started to do to embrace an analysis of climate change related risks is what they call scenario or forward-looking scenario-based analysis. And that fits in quite well with what central banks have already started to do after the financial crisis over a decade ago, which is stress testing the banking and the financial system. So this is an extra step in stress testing using scenario-based analysis, using long-term goals of decarbonizing economies, net zero targets. That's what the people are referring to today, and introducing pathways to net zero, and how that then gets implemented at the company, bank, and other sectoral levels. So that's really what central banks have started to do when it comes to climate change risks. Next slide, please. And what's interesting is that the industry is beginning, particular segments of the economy are beginning to respond to these scenario analysis, as you can see here. And people, for example, the oil industry is already now factoring in the possibility of a substantial reduction in demand for oil globally. Next slide, please. So what else is on central banks' agendas? So this is, I have to say, this is all being discussed almost in real time. Some of you may have seen a prominent article in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago discussing how climate change is becoming a major issue for central banks and what that means. There will be a major conference in June run by the BIS, Banque de France, and the IMF on central banks' green agendas. And one part I've already discussed, which is forward-looking scenario analysis, and that's sort of a learning by doing exercise to refer to the previous presentation. And then other aspects that are being discussed are how monetary policy is being affected, whether monetary policy should be tilted against brown assets and support the development of green assets, and the other aspects of the monetary policy. But let me not belabor that. Next slide, please. Yeah, what I wanted to show you here on this slide is how, along with central banks getting involved in analyzing, managing climate change-related risk. We've seen, you can almost see that if you go from left to right, left on the horizontal axis is 1990, the last point is 2021, and you see that as if you were climbing the multicolored mountain. And what this is all representing, it's probably too small for you to read every legend, but what this is showing you is how we're now seeing, even though it's very late and probably not enough, we're now seeing around the world more and more initiatives of government actors, central banks, municipalities, etc., trying to introduce policies, technologies to reduce carbon emissions. And that's just like a tsunami that's going to hit us, which will create a lot of new uncertainty, in this transition and new risks. Next slide, please.
Yep, less than 1 minute, Patrick.
Yes, exactly. Well, I sort of timed it right with the phone call in the middle. So apologies for that again. And here, I just want to conclude with, echoing a theme that Sharon emphasized in her keynote just earlier, which is that collaboration, cooperation among multiple stakeholders, different government agencies, private sector, civil society. That's really what's at stake at the moment, and a multidisciplinary approach, which sometimes puts me in a difficult position with my economic colleagues who are reluctant to jump out of the boundaries of the field that they are comfortable with and that they know. But we all have to do that. I think when it comes to climate change, we all have to jump out of our comfort zones and think in terms of the broader consequences, think in terms of cooperation and coordination. So with that, let me stop here. Thank you.